I'll have your papers back Thursday. I may be able to post the scores tonight, but I'm not sure. Later on today at 5:30 at USF Law School, there's a panel discussion that you might be interested in. It's about the legal issues affecting the Occupy movement. And among other people who are on the panel is one of our readers, lawyer, former star student in this course, and the San Francisco Chief of Police. It's in room 101 of Kendrick Hall at USF. Today we start the last, like 4 more classes. Time flies when you're having fun. The last part of the course is about the extent to which First Amendment rules are different depending on the medium of communication that is used. And one of the issues that arises, the short answer to that is yes, there are different rules for different media, and the court has struggled in some cases when confronted with a new medium of communication and has botched the job in a couple of cases. But one of the issues in the broadcast area is whether the government can require the media to speak and say things that they don't want to say. It's reminiscent of the Jehovah's Witnesses cases, the Pledge of Allegiance case, and the license plate live free or die case, where the court found that people can't be compelled to say things that they disagree with. Well, we'll find out that's not true in the broadcast context. And we'll consider broadcast as well as cable. They're different. Should they be different? And print, and finally the internet. But let's go back historically. Sort of the first time that the court encountered a new medium of communication was with regard to movies. And when they first became commercial and movies could be shown in local theaters and so on, a number of localities, cities, towns all over the country, set up censorship boards. They didn't necessarily call them censorship boards, but that's what they were. And they sat to decide what movies could be shown in the theaters in that community. Gave thumbs up or thumbs down to the movies that they approved or not. And that was, of course, challenged by the motion picture industry in its infancy at that time. And the court decided the Mutual Film case in 1914, in which the court ruled that there was no First Amendment issue involving the censorship of movies, because movies were simply a business. They weren't speech, they weren't the press, they were a business that could be regulated the same as any other local business could. And therefore, there was nothing to complain about when the local board rejected any particular movie. That was the law until 1952, when the court finally got around to overruling the Mutual Film case and granting First Amendment protection to movies as a form of speech. And then on the way to today, the court encountered sound trucks, which emerged after World War II. And you've probably seen them or heard them. They're still occasionally around. It's kind of an antique form of mass media, where a truck would have a loudspeaker on the top of the truck, and the truck driver or the passenger would go around with a microphone and be able to amplify the voice all over the community. They could play music, or they could urge you to vote for the local sheriff, or whatever they wanted to do. But a number of communities were upset with the intrusion of sound trucks into their residential communities. They made a lot of noise. They got people's attention. They disturbed the peace. They might come when somebody's napping or when children are sleeping. And they were somewhat of a nuisance. And a New Jersey town passed an ordinance that prohibited the use of sound trucks in the community. The case went to the Supreme Court in Kovacs versus Cooper, and the court upheld the ordinance, saying that it was perfectly reasonable for the community to ban the use of sound trucks. Notice that the ordinance was not content-based in any way. It wasn't aimed at electioneering speech. It wasn't aimed at rock music. We didn't have any then. And it wasn't aimed at any particular content. It was content neutral. And the court could have and should have looked at the case as a simple time, place, and manner restriction of the kind that we encountered with the Occupy issues. But what the court did say is that this medium of communication could be completely shut down in this particular community. And Robert Jackson, the former Attorney General and then Justice of the court, wrote a concurring opinion in the Kovacs case, where he said that, this will sound a little quaint to you now, this was 1949, Jackson says, the moving picture screen, the radio, the newspaper, the handbill, the sound truck, and the street corner orator have differing natures, values, abuses, and dangers. Each, in my view, is a law unto itself. The idea is that the First Amendment has different rules with regard to different media. I think that's significantly overstated, and in my view, the same First Amendment rules apply across the board to all media, except where, unfortunately, as in the broadcast context, the court has differentiated something about the particular medium and decided that it will be subject to different First Amendment rules. So broadcast, and that leads us to what is the most important case on broadcast ever, the Red Lion case, which involved the FCC's fairness doctrine, which the FCC abandoned in 1987. But you should know about the doctrine and its origin, because it dates back to the 1920s, when radio became a commercial medium of communication. And at the start of radio, there wasn't any government involvement, and whoever could scratch together the capital, the resources to buy the broadcasting equipment could become a broadcaster. And they used frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum as they pleased, whatever suited them, with the result being chaos. That is, that people would step on each other's signals, broadcast on the same frequency, change frequencies, move things around, and it was pretty messy. So to deal with that and to make the medium, this promising new medium, useful to Americans, the government established the Federal Radio Commission in the 20s, whose main job was to allocate frequencies on the spectrum to particular broadcasters. You had to apply for a license to broadcast, to use the public airwaves, this important national resource. The airwaves belong to all of us, and the government licensed a particular frequency to a particular broadcaster for a specified period of time, and sort of brought rationality and order to the chaotic radio business. And early on, even in the 20s, the Federal Radio Commission was set up with a mandate by Congress to regulate the airwaves in a manner consistent with the public interest. And early on, the Federal Radio Commission decided that as part of its obligation to ensure that licensees operate in the public interest, it would require them to cover the issues of the day and to do so fairly in the sense of putting on the air contrasting views on the issues of the day, not just what the broadcaster's agenda might be, but opposing points of view. And when the Federal Radio Commission became, in the early 30s, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, it continued the fairness doctrine, the two-part fairness doctrine. You've got to cover the issues of the day, and you have to give voice to contrasting or opposing views. And then, as the decades went by, the FCC added to the fairness doctrine the personal attack rule and also the political editorial rule, both of which were considered in the Red Lion case. And the premise for those rules was that during the presentation of views on a controversial public issue, that is, during the broadcaster's compliance with the general fairness doctrine, if during that the broadcaster personally attacked someone, that person would have a right to come on the air and respond to that personal attack. And similarly, if the broadcaster editorially supported or opposed the candidate who was trashed would have the opportunity to come on the air and respond to the broadcaster's endorsement of the other guy. Well, Red Lion came about when a religious broadcaster, Billy Joe Hargis, in rural Pennsylvania, broadcast an attack on a journalist by the name of Fred Cook, who had written a book critical of the darling of the religious right at that time, Barry Goldwater, in the early 60s. And Hargis went on his air, on his Christian Crusade station, and attacked Cook as basically a communist who had done a lot of unpatriotic things, attacking J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, attacking the CIA, and attacking Barry Goldwater. And when Cook found out about this attack, he may have been put up to it, I don't know. He made a request to the station to come on the air and respond to this personal attack. The station refused to give him any airtime, and that led to litigation between the station and the FCC, because the FCC said, you violated the personal attack rule by attacking him and then not allowing him to respond. The regulations were formalized not long before the Red Lion decision, and you see them in the decision itself. The personal attack rule says, when, during the presentation of views on a controversial issue of public importance, an attack is made on the character, the honesty, and so on, of an individual, the licensee, the broadcaster, has the obligation, having made the attack, to notify the person attacked, to give them a tape or a transcript of the attack, and to offer them a reasonable opportunity to respond over the licensee's facilities. There were exceptions to that. It wasn't applicable to attacks on foreign groups or foreign public figures. It wasn't applicable to personal attacks made by legally qualified candidates for office, and it wasn't applicable to bona fide newscasts and so on. But the attack on Cook didn't fall into any of those categories. And then the political editorial rule was very similar. That is, when the licensee in an editorial endorses or opposes a candidate for office, same thing. You've got to notify the other one, have to give them a script or a tape, and have to offer a reasonable opportunity to respond. Well, all of this was challenged by the broadcasters and brought to the Supreme Court and decided in the Red Lion case. And the court had to decide first whether the FCC's fairness doctrine regulation and its sub-rules on personal attack and political editorial, whether they were authorized by Congress or whether the FCC was off on a frolic of its own. And then second, if these regulations were authorized, the question is, do they comply with the First Amendment? And the court found that they were both authorized, and that rather than abridging the freedom of speech or the press, these regulations enhanced these freedoms. And the court, as Justice White recounts the history of the fairness doctrine and acknowledges that broadcasting is clearly a medium affected by a First Amendment interest, but then says differences in the characteristics of new media justify differences in the First Amendment standards applied to them, citing Kovacs, the soundtrack case. So the proposition that the court is espousing here is that differences in the characteristics of the media justify differences in the application of the First Amendment to them. What then are the characteristics of the broadcast medium that would justify regulation of the content, at least to some extent, of the content of what the broadcasters choose to put on the air? Well, the court says there's substantially more wannabe broadcasters out there than there are frequencies available for broadcast. So it is legitimate for government to have a role in deciding who gets to use these scarce and extremely valuable frequencies, part of the public domain, part of what we, the people, own with public airwaves. And if they're going to make available to a broadcaster the exclusive use of a frequency, shouldn't that carry with it some obligations to act in the public interest? Justice White says a licensee has no constitutional right to monopolize a radio frequency to the exclusion of his fellow citizens. There's nothing in the First Amendment that prevents the government from requiring a licensee to share his frequency with others. The court seemed to be suggesting that the FCC could have, if it wished, said to broadcaster A, you can have 740 on the AM dial from midnight to noon, and broadcaster B can have that same frequency from noon to midnight. There's nothing unconstitutional about that. The frequency can be shared in that way. Well, Justice White said, given that, then nothing in the First Amendment prevents the government from requiring a licensee to conduct himself as a proxy or a fiduciary with obligations to present those views and voices that are representative of the community. And that's what the general fairness doctrine is about. As I said, Justice White acknowledged that broadcasters have a First Amendment interest and freedom to put on the air what they choose to a certain extent. But White says it's the right of the viewers and the listeners, not the right of the broadcasters, which is paramount. And then he launches into one of these rhapsodic treatments of the marketplace of ideas. It's the purpose of the First Amendment to preserve an uninhibited marketplace of ideas rather than to allow monopolization of that market. And it's the right of the public to receive suitable access to social, political, aesthetic, moral, and other ideas, which is crucial here. This is new, that we the people have a right to have our government ensure that we get views representative of the community, that government makes sure that the marketplace of ideas functions as it's supposed to. But the broadcasters argued that if we have to comply with the fairness doctrine, that's inevitably going to lead us to self-censorship, the same kind of chilling effect, the same kind of notion in New York Times versus Sullivan. Why is that? Because what we have to sell is airtime. That's our inventory. And if the government makes us give away our inventory based on what we have said on the air, or not said, in the case of the general fairness doctrine, we're just going to shy away from speaking out on controversial issues to the extent that we can get away with it. And Justice White acknowledges that that would be a serious matter, but it is at present entirely speculative, at present, back at 1969, entirely speculative, and if experience shows that the net effect of enforcing the fairness doctrine is to reduce rather than enhance the volume and quality of coverage, there'll be time enough for the court to reconsider the outcome. And then Justice White, to sort of soften the blow for the broadcasters, lists what is not involved in the red line case. There's no question here of the Commission's refusal to permit the broadcaster to carry a particular program or to publish his own views. The government's not trying to do that. There's no question of government censorship of a particular program, and there's no question of the official government view dominating public broadcasting. The fairness doctrine is more narrow than what some governments in some countries routinely would do. And then even in 1969, the broadcasters argued spectrum scarcity is not any longer an issue. There are lots of new media of communication so that the views across the community, views representative of any community, can easily be published and heard, and you don't need to have government step in and tell broadcasters what they have to do. But Justice White says scarcity is not entirely a thing of the past. And adds that the fact remains that existing broadcasters, those who have their license, have often attained their present position because of their initial government selection, and they have thereby gotten significant advantage over any would-be broadcasters, anybody who wants to enter into the market. The government has blessed these licensees, in many cases for decades, with the use of a particular frequency authorized by the government, and that is enormously economically valuable, the fruit of a preferred position conferred by the government on the licensees. So White then sums up that there are basically three reasons for holding that the First Amendment is not violated by the fairness doctrine. That is, the scarcity of broadcast frequencies, which legitimizes the government role in allocating the frequencies. The government's role in allocating those frequencies and giving a big economic boost to the broadcasters. And third, the legitimate claims of those unable, without government assistance, to gain access to those frequencies for the expression of their views. So for those reasons, the court upholds the general fairness doctrine and its sub-rules on personal attacks and political editorials. And then, as time went by, the FCC issued a couple of reports on how it administered the fairness doctrine. And one of them was 1974, just 5 years after Red Lion, where the FCC explained to the public, the listening public, the viewing public, and to broadcasters exactly how it operated the fairness doctrine business. It said that it did not monitor broadcasts. They didn't have FCC bureaucrats listening in to every broadcast or even sampling every broadcaster's broadcast day. Rather, the FCC's action, if any, was entirely complaint activated. The FCC didn't do anything unless they received a complaint that their broadcaster was violating the fairness doctrine, not complying with it. And the overwhelming majority of the complaints were put in file. Nothing ever happened with them. Didn't even notify the broadcasters. A minority